Support for Carolina Business Review provided by Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries.
Well, a new energy reality has come to the Carolinas, and it's more than just the merger of Duke Energy and Progress Energy, or SCANA's new nuclear construction, or Charlotte's effort to become an energy nucleus, or practical debate about how we might develop our natural gas and alternative fuels. But really, both intentional and unintentional forces are shaping and empowering, no pun intended, this new thought, and with it, some opportunity. So the question is, where does it all lead? Welcome again to the most widely watched source of Carolina business and public policy. I'm Chris William, and this time, business insiders Ellen Ruff and Louis Gossett join us in a moment to discuss some of the region's most critical issues around energy and industry.
Major funding also by Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care when and where you need it. The Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. And by Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. This edition of Carolina Business Review was recorded April 25th, 2014. On this week's program, an energy and industry panel featuring Ellen Ruff of McGuire Woods and Louis Gossett from the South Carolina Manufacturers Alliance. And now, here's Chris William.
Welcome to our program, and happy spring. Yay, it's here and the weather's finally nice. Ellen, nice to have you back.
Thank you, Chris. Delighted to be here.
And Louis, same thing. Always good to have you.
Good to be back.
You know, we're going to talk about energy and we're going to talk about industry. Let's start fairly broad. Ellen, is it an understatement, or is it an overstatement, rather, to say that the cost of energy in the Carolinas is one of the main reasons that the Carolinas have done so well in economic development and community development these past few decades?
I think it's been very important. Louis can comment on South Carolina, but at least during my tenure at Duke, when I was at Duke, we did a lot with customers, and energy prices were among the first 5 issues on their list when they were looking to relocate.
Yeah.
Very, very important.
Would you agree with that, Louis?
No question. Our utilities in South Carolina have been some of the most valuable partners on the economic development team that the state's had in the 20 years that I've been involved in looking at this kind of thing. And without them, the deals don't happen. And because of the rates and because of the way that they approach customer service, we've had an advantage.
You know, and now let's overlay on top of this fact that natural gas, as you both know, has been very inexpensive, a very cheap commodity. And again, Ellen, I'll start with you, since you were at Duke Energy for so long, Duke Power, and many of the other names before that. That natural gas now seems to be the new coal. In other words, it's the fuel of choice. The new plants coming online, natural gas powered, if they're not the SCANA plant, which is the nuclear plant. So it seems to be a pretty big stake in the ground around the cost of natural gas. Would you expect natural gas to stay low? What are the implications about natural gas?
Well, I think certainly if you look at what has been added in recent times, other than the summer plant, SCANA's nuclear plant, it's all gas. Gas at its prices, when you then compare the units and decide what you're going to build, gas comes out as the least cost just about every time. In the past, fuel's been variable, so your capital cost to build a gas plant, you could put it up in 18 months, get it to run, but you project what the fuel costs are over time. And they have been, in times past, up as high as,
1750.
1750.
Wow.
And now they have run in the last couple of years, they've run at 3, at the Henry Hub at 4. You know, and looking out over 20 years, they look kind of flat in the midpoint, Chris, around 5.
Could it be that long? Could it be 20 years out that these prices stay this low?
Hard to know.
Yeah.
I think it's very difficult. It depends on what the production will be. And so the price around gas, it has to be high enough to support new production. So it'll be that give and take between how much you have, how much you have to sell, what there is to buy, and there'll be issues around pipelines and where they're located, so you can get the gas to them.
You know, I want to come back I'm going to come back about this pipeline because there's been an initial announcement that Piedmont Natural Gas, Duke Energy, SCANA all want to build a new pipeline into the Carolinas. I mean, this is a big step. Before we do that, let's wade back in with you. The manufacturers in the Palmetto State, do they watch this natural gas? How much of an impact is the cost of natural gas on how they project their business to be? And I'm not just talking about quarterly results, Louis, but when they start to plan and capital invest, what does that mean to them?
I think the price of natural gas has been one of the biggest contributors to South Carolina's leadership in the reshoring of American manufacturing jobs. As a matter of fact, where you really heard the comments from the manufacturers in South Carolina about natural gas is when it was at 1750, and how devastating that was, not just for powering the plants, but a lot of people forget that natural gas is a raw material for products that are made, like PET that goes into the plastic Coke bottles and things like that. So we lost plants in South Carolina that could no longer afford the raw material they needed to make the product back in 06 and 07 when the costs were so high. Now, with these prices low, it is a contributing factor, some would argue maybe the biggest of several, to the fact that American manufacturing jobs are coming back.
So, policy. Energy policy in North Carolina, energy policy in South Carolina, and then of course, we have federal energy policy. I know you know all of these things well. Again, start with you. How does the federal, or maybe the lack of any kind of federal energy focus, how does that maybe bleed down to the states like North Carolina that now has a mining commission all around this, what's going to happen for drilling? Give us a sense of that.
Well, I think the lack of policy, at least in terms, if you look on the nuclear side, you haven't had a lot of change on the nuclear side, either funding by the government or a statement by the government, or looking at subsidies perhaps, and I know there are both sides of that we'll talk about, whether or not you have subsidies with insurance or Price-Anderson. But I think the most significant issue that has coming down in the last year or two has been the discussion of, absent legislation, what's the impact on coal? What is either the EPA going to do? What regulations will there be that will impact our coal plants going forward? Either the coal ash or air, groundwater. So we're expecting to see more from the federal government, I think, on that front, and it'll be contentious, I believe. It's not legislated; it will be regulatory.
So, Louis, a state like South Carolina, that's it's a neighbor to the north now, has some real momentum going forward when it comes to fracking. And drilling and really developing. If the motivation's right and prices start to rise, there seem to be more drills going in the ground. But what's the energy policy in South Carolina? North Carolina has first mover advantage right now, but is there talk about offshore or even onshore looking for natural gas in the Palmetto State?
There certainly is, and as a matter of fact, I think it has pretty good support in the Capitol. You can say that some of that breaks down maybe along partisan lines, but there are people on both sides of the aisle that support South Carolina aggressively moving into the discussions and perhaps the participation in offshore drilling, at least exploration. And I think that the thing that you really get to when you talk about energy policy in the United States is the fundamental lack of one. Right. And the fact that we are sitting, as Dan D'Amico with Nucor told one of our groups a little over a year ago, on the precipice of an enormous potential energy economy, and yet we're not addressing it. We're not taking. We don't. There's no leadership in our government to say we're going to make this a priority because it is the key. It's the key to bringing back the good jobs in this country. It's the key to future prosperity, and it's got its own jobs and its own money-making capabilities. So coming up with a comprehensive strategy in Washington may be too much to ask for with the way that it's as dysfunctional it is, but it's something that's necessary.
Could states do it without Washington guidance?
To some extent, they do, but at the same time, when you're dealing with the offshore drilling situation, you really are at the mercy of the feds when it comes to that. They've got to include you in their 5-year plan as to whether or not you can even be involved in the potential for exploration. They control everything. So states may want it, states may see advantages, and in fact, those advantages would come, but you got to wait for the feds, just like the states in the Midwest and along the Gulf are waiting on Keystone. I mean, these things are ridiculous. Energy policy in this country, when it's made or when actions are taken by our government, and I know this is a trite saying, but it takes longer to do those kinds of things than it did to gear up, fight, and win a world war. There's no excuse for that, and our economy is what suffers.
Yeah, Ellen, I mean, you've been on the front lines of this kind of legislative and regulatory change and battle. I mean, how do you react to that?
I think Lewis is exactly right, and whether, in North and South Carolina, using it as an example, for example, in North Carolina, the smokestack legislation that we had in '02 in North Carolina.
And explain what that is.
Smokestacks was the regulating of air emissions coming from coal plants.
Right.
And North Carolina, on the legislative side, decided it wanted to move forward to restrict that. The investments in working with the utilities and with environmentalists and manufacturing community geared up to do legislation. It was state legislation alone. But at the same time, you always have a federal overlay. Even if you have your own state legislation, federal legislation, you're going to have to meet whichever is the more restrictive standard, generally speaking. And what we need is a strategy where everyone, the state, the feds, we all know what we're doing, and we deploy to the same strategy. Not just a vague strategy, but a more specific. If you're going to build nuclear plants, it'll take us at least 10 years to do that. If you want to build small reactors instead of big ones,
Right.
it's going to take time to get it licensed, the rules for the regulation, the construction, and everyone knowing in 10 years that you're going to be able to do that, and manufacturers being able to count on what we're going to do. So I think the lack of a national federal energy policy, to me, is the most significant issue going forward.
And folks will hear you say, both of you, they'll hear you say that, and they'll agree with it, but there won't be quite the passion, because I don't get the sense that we've reached a tipping point for pain or punitive action on our own wallets or economic development, or have we, or is it imminent?
Well, I think on the utility side, we haven't really reached a tipping point. The lights still go on when the switch goes on.
It's still cheap.
We've had, it's still, especially in the Southeast, relatively inexpensive out of a customer's monthly bill. And it's also a long way away. When you talk 10 years or 15 or 20 years even, and people think, well, the economy, the difficulties in the economy, how we're going to pay for groceries, what chunk does that take for? Do I have a job? I think the current economic pressures have made the utility side, and electricity in particular, less critical at the moment. I don't know if you'd agree with that, Lewis.
Well, I think that is the case. I'm going to steal something, as he knows I've done on several occasions since I first heard it, from former Duke Energy CEO Jim Rogers. He talked in terms of cathedral thinking. You don't start and build and complete a cathedral in a couple of years. They take a century to build. And so you have to be thinking in those kind of broad terms to deal with energy policy. And I think the utilities have done that. The utilities, when I meet with them and talk with them, they're always thinking ahead about what are the needs going to be 10, 20, and 30 years from now. Duke Energy, apparently just about every plant they've got is going to need to be relicensed or replaced in the next 30 or 40 years. If they wait for the 30 or 40 years to start making those decisions, we're in trouble. One of the things that bothers me about American energy policy, or the lack thereof, are the impediments. And I have said for a long time that the environmental movement in this country is very, very good at understanding what will stop certain kinds of progress. And if you want to stop manufacturing progress and the creation of jobs, become an impediment to the production of energy. And it's too difficult to get these plants approved and licensed and built. The delays, the
You mean
regulations.
the nuclear sites?
nuclear, coal, gas.
Do you
It
think,
doesn't matter.
Well, do you think the environmentalists stop the coal, or do you think the natural gas cost stop the coal?
Well, I think you might be able to argue both. In that sense, based on what I've heard. I mean, one of the things that has disturbed me about the fact that we've, in essence, killed a coal economy is we did it without planning or thinking about what would replace it.
Right.
You know, when folks talk about, leaving fossil fuels behind, which we're not going to do, and getting something else, okay, if you do that right now, how long before we get the alternative? And we've, in essence, demonized and destroyed the coal economy to some extent without necessarily having Plan B, or the next step in place, and that's the government. The good news is the utilities don't usually get caught short like that because they're thinking, they're trying to put together those long-term policies and approaches, despite the fact that our government won't.
You mentioned something I want to come back to, coal ash.
Yes.
Very popular term that people understand these days. Even 2 or 3 months ago, people couldn't even tell you what coal ash meant around the utility industry. Now Duke Power had a problem with a coal ash containment pond in northern North Carolina, and it's been all over the news, and Duke has been all over the news. So a couple questions about this. The coal ash retention ponds and the coal ash issue as we know it now is not a new issue. Am I right about that?
You are correct.
Okay. So,
And it's not a regional issue. It's a national issue. For as much coal as we have used as part of our production, these
right.
ponds have existed for
Hundreds of ponds, I would guess.
50, 60, 75 years.
So the spotlight being shined on coal ash now will cause all of the utilities, not just Duke Energy, or to clean these up and to do it now and to fix the ones that might even be on the margins. And I'm not arguing for or against coal or for or against coal ash ponds or however we have to do it, but Ellen, isn't this, as you said earlier, when we turn on the lights, we want them to come on right away and we want to have it cheap. So when we do that, we've been doing that with coal. So how, I guess, is there culpability in this coal ash pond? Is it Duke Energy? Or how do we look at this that may be not being looked at?
Well, I think it goes a little bit to what Lewis said about transition and dealing with an issue that comes up. We had coal for 50 or 60 years. It was more than half of the generation of Duke, even more, until the nuclear came forward. When we talked a little bit ago about 2002 and air emissions, Duke spent over $1 billion, $1.5 billion, for air emissions to clean up the air and clean up its coal plants. We did that in 2002. Progress Energy did the same thing under state legislation. So now we are here and we're in 2014, and we have determined, as we will always make progress, that coal ash we need to look at differently. We need to look at it perhaps in ways, and not all the ponds are the same. Mm-hmm. Paul Newton, the president of Duke Energy Carolinas, spoke this week at the Environmental Review Commission and laid out and really talked at some length about the different ponds. And Duke has 33 ponds, I believe, across the Carolinas. And there's been a comparison to South Carolina and said, well, look at what South Carolina did, Santee Cooper and SCANA. Mm-hmm. There's a vast difference in the number and amount of sites. It's a very complicated issue,
Meaning
I think,
that North Carolina's Duke Energy component had more coal ash ponds?
It has more. The Duke Energy and Progress together have, I believe, 33 sites. SCANA and Santee, and Lewis can correct me, I think they each had one. I don't know if they had more than one. They might have had a couple.
It's a very small number.
But it's a very small number in comparison. So it's not going to be a quick fix. But I think you're talking about a company that's always showed itself to be in the forefront of environmental and being willing to work with its constituents and others to address the problem, and they will.
Well, the
But
cost,
it's not quick.
The cost for fixing the coal ash, or remediating, let's say it that way, remediating coal ash, it looks like it's squarely going to be on the shoulders of not stakeholders, but rather customers. Does it need, is that where it needs to be?
Well, what will be addressed traditionally, costs of costs associated with generation and the different plants, they have been what are called rate base issues, or you go and you ask the commission, the Utilities Commission, both states, for the right to recover that. And traditionally, an environmental remediation cost has been as part of the cost of delivering the generation. Certainly when you operated the plants, the cost and the good rates that you received, the benefit was received by the customers. But it's going to be complicated. Chris Ayers, who's the executive director of the North Carolina Public Staff, he was quoted in the paper, I think this week, as saying, traditionally that would be a customer cost, but that will be something that will be determined by the commission at the time, unless there's legislation or something that will deal with that in a different way.
South Carolina and the Savannah River site for years has been quite an economic generator, but recently, current Obama administration has proposed a furloughing based on a GAO report about cost overruns of what they're doing in the Savannah River site. I mean, it's very complex, and I'm not even going to get most of it right, but if they do shut this down, even temporarily for a period of a month or a year or 5 years, or furlough it or mothball it, how big of an impact will that have on South Carolina?
Well, the MOX operation, I guess, is what you're referring
Yes,
to. And
yeah.
the thing is that it's 1,300 people that are working there. They're extremely good.
These are high-paying
These are
jobs.
very
High-paying
good paying
jobs,
jobs. Very good paying jobs. The Savannah River site at one point in South Carolina was, 30 or 40,000 employees,
Yep.
and now it's down around 10 or so, but at the most. But 1,200 or 1,300 of them are engaged in MOX. And to lose that in that area would be a significant economic blow. It's one thing to lose 1,300 jobs, and you can't diminish that. But when you're talking about jobs that pay that amount of money and that have been that good for that long, it's a profound impact. And so it's a good thing that Senator Lindsey Graham and Congressman Joe Wilson and Governor Haley and Attorney General Wilson are engaged and are trying to do something about this. They believe the federal government has an obligation to us
Yeah.
that they've got to live up to.
How's the Tea Party element in South Carolina come down on this?
I don't know how they come down on that. I didn't think that I'd really be engaged with the Tea Party that much in terms of issues until nullification came up. And
Explain
we
that.
well, they tried to claim that they were going to nullify Obamacare in South Carolina. And I don't know if they've read a whole lot of history, but South Carolina tried that back in the 19th century, and it was a complete disaster then, and it was almost, it would have killed, if they'd been successful, the private insurance industry in South Carolina, which none of us could have. And the thing about it is I was accused, as my friend Otis Rawle and others were accused, of being pro-Obamacare. I can tell you right now, based on my member sentiment, if the nullification bill would have ended Obamacare, I would have had a tent city of manufacturing CEOs on the State House lawn, and that would have made Occupy Wall Street look like summer camp. And so it was really kind of amazing that we found ourselves in that fight. But
You
the
know, those
implications were
stranger
profound.
things have happened on the State House. You know that, right?
Seeing a bunch of CEOs in tents would have been maybe the most that we've seen.
You know, a couple minutes left. We've talked a lot about coal ash. We've talked about the price of natural gas. We've talked. Does natural? I mean, what does this make SCANA look like building the nuclear facility that they're building? Does it make them look like they're geniuses and ahead of the curve, or does it make them look like they might have something on their hands that will certainly work, but maybe the timing of it wasn't the best?
Well, from my perspective, they'll be happy they have it in 10 years. They will be happy when that plant is finished and it is up and running. And because with a nuclear plant, once it's up and running, in our experience on the Duke system and others, it runs. And the fuel is inexpensive, and you don't have the issue of volatile fuel, and it contributes greatly to low rates in South Carolina. So I think
Yeah.
geniuses in current terms is always hard to use. But I think they'll be glad they have it, and so will their customers in the state.
I'm going to quote
30
another Duke Energy person, Chuck Claunch, who we both know very well. He said years ago, we're making long-term decisions, and in the utility industry in general. And if you look at SCANA, I think that's what they've done. I think that they have made decisions now, like people did 50 or 60 years ago, that will benefit us going forward for decades. And it's a good thing they're doing it.
That's going to have to be the last word. Thank you both for being on the program. It's always nice to see you both.
Thank you.
See you.
You know,
Enjoyed
it's
it.
interesting to hear the debate and the dialogue, and best of luck to you.
Thank you.
Happy
Thank you.
summer.
Same to you.
Thank you. Thank you for watching our program. Of course, if you have any comments, suggestions,
Good or bad, we want to hear them. CarolinaBusinessReview.org. Until next week, I'm Chris William. Have a nice weekend. Good night.
Major funding for Carolina Business Review was provided by the Duke Endowment, a private foundation enriching communities in the Carolinas through higher education, healthcare, rural churches, and children's services. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of North Carolina. Who's responsible for rising healthcare costs? Join us and many others in a candid discussion at letstalkcost.com. Grant Thornton. Operating in more than 100 countries, our tax, audit, and advisory professionals specialize in helping companies unlock their growth potential. Novant Health, bringing you world-class technology, clinicians, and care, when and where you need it. Sunoco, a global manufacturer of consumer and industrial packaging products and provider of packaging services, with more than 300 operations in 35 countries. Blue Cross and Blue Shield of South Carolina, where healthcare is changing for the better. Find out how at ahealthysc.tv. And by viewers like you. Thank you. Promotional consideration provided by Business North Carolina Magazine. For more information, visit carolinabusinessreview.com.